This is Open to Debate. I'm John Donvan. Hi, everybody. For an episode that we're considering a back-to-school special with a debate about what is going on in America's public school classrooms, or should be, or shouldn't be. It's a debate that's going to see some of the tug of war that's also taking place over the words woke and wokeness, which is a word often used by policymakers on the right as a put-down of some of the goals and methods taken up by the progressive left. But it's also a word that the left stands by as capturing something worthy, especially as intended by those who first coined the term to recognize inequalities in society and whose goal was to do something about them. Of course, there is a lot of room here to disagree on what the words woke and wokeness actually mean, and perhaps we will see some of that as we discuss something as complex as public school education. Here's the question we're debating. Wokeness in public schools, hurting or helping students? Let's please meet our debaters. On the question of whether wokeness in public schools is hurting or helping, we have Ian Rowe. He's going to argue that it is hurting. Ian is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and co-founder of Vertex Partnership Academies. That's a charter public school system in the Bronx. His other previous roles include a teacher for Teach for America, also CEO of a nonprofit charter school network in the South Bronx and Lower East Side of Manhattan. And he has been Deputy Director of Post-Secondary Success at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Ian, welcome to Open to Debate.
Thank you, John, and thank you to the full Open Debate team, and thank you to Dr. Caldera. While I imagine we strongly disagree on whether or not wokeness in public schools is helping or hurting students, I really do appreciate the opportunity to discuss the question.
Thanks very much for that, Ian. But it is now time to bring the floor and the attention and the spotlight to Altheria Caldera, who is arguing that wokeness is helping students. Altheria is a senior professional lecturer at the School of Education at American University. Her research focuses on promoting racial equity in schools, specifically in areas of language and literacy, Black girlhood, and equitable education practices. She spent decades herself as a teacher in middle schools, secondary, and post-secondary schools, so a lot of experience right where it's happening. Altheria, thank you so much for joining us on Open to Debate.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
So let's get to our opening statements. We want to ask each of you to take a few minutes to explain why you're taking the side that you are. Again, Ian, you are up first, and again, you are arguing that wokeness in public schools is hurting students. Please tell us why.
Thank you, John. And again, thank you, Dr. Caldera. So for the last 15 years, I've run public charter schools in the Bronx, New York, with primarily low-income Black and Hispanic students. I've seen the extremely harmful effects when public school teachers see boys and girls not as individuals, but as just victimized representatives of their race or gender or whatever superficial characteristic that some educators insist makes these students inherently oppressed. Thankfully, as a public school leader, I have also seen what happens when the empowering alternative is practiced, when students are treated as individuals with inherent dignity and agency, children who have the capacity to overcome adults constantly telling them that they are trapped in unjust systems, and young people who ultimately have the ability to lead self-determined lives of meaning and purpose. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines woke as being, quote, aware of and actively attentive to important facts and issues, especially issues of racial and social justice, end quote. That's a fine definition. However, in practice, the definition goes further. A woke person is someone who typically has three core beliefs. First, systems of oppression are woven into the very foundation of all of America's institutions, culture, society, and laws. Second, any disparity in outcomes at the identity group level, such as race, is proof of discrimination and oppression. And third, finally, the solution to all of this is not equality of opportunity for individuals, but rather forcing equality of outcomes at the identity group level, or shorthand, equity. Dr. Caldera, I reviewed some of your research, and I saw that you recently described white supremacy culture as, quote, the system of domination that governs our everyday lives, that is very pervasive in everything we do, end quote. Racism and discrimination of many types certainly still exist in our society, and we all need to fight it, whether it is real white supremacists or so-called anti-racist ideologues who often practice racism themselves. But do you know what also exists in our society? Opportunity. 7 of the wealthiest 8 ethnic groups in the United States today are populations of color. Every year, millions of people of every background risk their lives to come to the United States in search of opportunity. Wokeness ignores the tens of millions of the so-called marginalized who thrive in this country every day, not because they embraced the woke message of victimhood, but because they rejected victimhood and learned that there are pathways to prosperity in the very same systems that woke advocates claim are rigged against them. I look forward to discussing more about how wokeness is harming children in public education and why I believe the pursuit of individual agency is the correct path forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. All right, Altheria, you are taking the opposite side. You disagree quite strongly. You believe that wokeness in public schools is actually helping students. Here is your chance, please, to tell us why.
Sure. I am a proud member of what the right has called the woke mob, a later label that is meant to be a pejorative, but which in actuality is imbued with qualities that are central to our democracy. Recognizing the power that language holds to shape hearts and minds, conservatives have been successful at using and misusing words to paint a false narrative about what it means to be woke. As is characteristic of their anti-truth movement, they have obscured the true meaning and intent of woke and have denigrated those who advocate for wokeness by portraying us as dangerous, Marxist, unpatriotic militants. For these reasons, I must explain in simple terms what it means to be woke. To be woke means to be sociopolitically aware. It means being conscious of societal injustices and committed to social justice. To believe in the need to be woke, one must first recognize that our society has fallen short of living up to its aspiration of liberty and justice for all. This is the point that Mr. Rowe fails to make in his argument that we do believe in society being unjust and that we work to make it more just. And the failure to acknowledge that, to me, is the center of the conflict. In public schools, wokeness looks like teachers who integrate examinations of social and political issues that impact the lives of their students. As an example, a high school English teacher might have their students read about how shifting immigration policies have determined what populations have been allowed to become citizens and what populations have not. The teacher encourages students to look for patterns and ask questions about who has benefited from these laws and who hasn't. Students can then write essays proposing ways to make immigration laws fair, or write personal narratives about how today's immigration laws impact their lives and the lives of their families. Conservatives argue that woke teachers indoctrinate students. To the contrary, woke teachers promote inquiry, exploration, analytical thinking, and listening to different perspectives. I advocate for woke pedagogy for several reasons. Students, number one, students should see their lives reflected in curricula. Number two, students should learn to develop the critical thinking necessary to seek solutions to long-standing societal challenges. The right would argue that there are no long-standing challenges that we need to address. All we need to do is work hard and exercise agency. Schools should prepare students to be engaged citizens in a democratic society. In sum, I want schools to be places where students are encouraged to ask meaningful questions, to seek answers to persistent problems, and to work collaboratively in pursuit of discovery. I want this kind of school because I want this kind of society. It is important to point out that this is the kind of school that I and other social justice educators envision. With a few exceptions, it is not a description of schools as they are. Those who believe that schools are woke are not dealing in reality, because the truth is that the deluge of state laws introduced by conservatives and passed over the last 5 years have limited the pursuit of truth and intellectualism in schools. So the question guiding tonight's debate might better be asked in this way. If public schools were woke, would students be helped or harmed? And I obviously believe that woke education would help students learn how laws and policies function, to oppress or liberate, to develop empathy and compassion, and feel empowered to be change agents. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Althea. I want to check in with each of you very, very briefly to ask each of you this question. I'll go to you first, Ian, and I'm going to ask Althea the same question. What did you hear from your opponent that you think she is getting most fundamentally wrong that you would want to debate back against?
Well, I run schools, particularly in communities where we see many of the racial disparities that I think people who describe themselves as woke is this is what they're aware of. They're aware of these injustices that occur. I think where Dr. Caldera and I probably fall down is that I think she falls into the second description I described, which is that any disparity must be due to systemic racism that has been woven into the very fabric of the country. And that kind of monocausal thinking, in my view, blinds you to all the other factors which are far more determinative. For example, very quickly, in the district...
I'm going to ask you to hold the example, just so that in the interest of time, but we've heard what you had to say on that. And Althea, I want to go to you the same question as you've heard from your opponent. What do you think he's most fundamentally getting wrong in his argument?
I, first of all, have to say that you're not correct, Mr. Rowe, in the assumption that I attribute all disparities to racial injustice. Racial injustice is just one of many forms of injustice that students experience in this country as a result of living in a white supremacist culture. So that's the first thing. It's not all about race, but it is largely about race. Secondly, I'll answer your question, John, about what I feel like Mr. Rowe gets wrong here. And that is the belief that if we are woke, we cannot also be advocates of individual pursuits of excellence. And that is simply not the case. I don't operate in a binary world where there is either or. I believe in both and. So yes, is it important for students to be aware of systemic injustices and have individual motivation, show initiative and drive and discipline and determination to reach their goals. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
And we are taking on this question, wokeness in public schools, hurting or helping students. Our debaters, Ian Rowe, American Enterprise Institute Senior Fellow, and Althea Caldera, Senior Professional Lecturer at American University School of Education. And what we heard them say in their opening statements, they did spend quite a bit of time talking about what the word woke means to them. And we heard Ian Rowe say that in his view, wokeness in schools is kind of an agenda of teaching students that the world is, if they are members of minority groups, that the world is kind of rigged against them, that it is kind of eternally that way, that white supremacy culture not only exists, but that it is a system of keeping them down, and that his concern is that when students have internalized this notion, that it has a negative impact on their own sense of agency, and that's his main concern about the impact on students and why he says it's hurting. From Althea Caldera, we're saying that she says, okay, I'm a member of what's called the woke mob, but she feels that from both her opponent and the right in general, that their depiction of what the word woke means is something of a caricature. And her pushback comprises the notion that wokeness is simply an awareness of injustices and a desire to do something about them. And then in terms of students, that includes making them aware of those injustices in a way that she feels increases their sense of inquiry and their critical thinking, and ultimately as citizens to be able to seek solutions. So I hear from the beginning we have a disagreement about what this word wokeness means, and I think we would be better off not being stuck on arguing the definition a great deal further, because we've heard where both of you stand on that, particularly in your last thoughts, but to talk about some of the actual things that are alleged by you, Ian, to be happening in classrooms in a very specific way. That you would attribute to this kind of woke culture, and for you to make the case that, number one, these things are happening. Number two, what the impact on students is. And I'd like to then let Altheria respond to what you're saying is happening. So if you could, pick an example of a program, a policy, a curriculum, a book, anything like that would kind of make this more concrete.
Well, let me say a couple of things. First is, not only as you just described, is if a student hears over and over and over again that they're rigged, there's in systems that are rigged, that are dominant, not only is that harmful to the students, there's a whole other separate issue where this focus on systemic injustice being the central problem facing our school system, and where it's white supremacy culture, it is the case that only about 30% of all American students are reading at grade level. 37%, according to the 2022 National Assessment for Educational Progress, only 37% of all white 8th grade students are reading at grade level. It's unlikely that systemic racism is the reason that white students have perennially, in the entire 50 years that the National Assessment for Educational Progress has been given, has a majority of white students been reading at grade level.
Okay, I'm gonna jump in, because the question that you're answering there really is: are there other factors that might explain the underperformance of students? But my question to you is, what's happening in the classroom? And you said to be told over and over and over again that the system is rigged. Where do you see that lesson being taught? And if you can cite an example that of a program that you would want to stop.
Yeah, there are several examples. So, for example, in Evanston, Illinois, and throughout the country, schools typically led by woke educators have done something what's called a privilege walk. And what a privilege walk is, imagine a classroom of students. The teacher lines all the students up in a horizontal line and then gives them a series of instructions, which are along the lines of, if you're white, take 2 steps forward. If you're black, take 3 steps backward. And there are a series of questions that, based on your either skin color, your gender, your class, you have to take this physical position that puts you forward or backward. Well, guess what? That is an example of a practice that's inspired by critical race theory, that makes assumptions about who you are, whether or not you are. What's also another exercise where students are asked to place themselves on what's called an oppression matrix, where literally an oppression matrix is something
is there a school district where you can cite that actually?
Evanston, Illinois is just one of many.
Okay, so you've given us a couple of concrete examples, and Altheria, I'd like you to address the example number one. I might be asking you, do you agree that this is happening in schools? Do you think it's a useful lesson for students? And I want to go back to Ian to talk about why that's harmful for students, but I want to let you have a response to the question first.
Sure. I think I said in my opening that, with few exceptions, wokeness is not the nature of schools. So I'm sure that Mr. Rowe can point out one example here and maybe another example there. But what I'm referring to is the pervasiveness or the widespread use of wokeness in schools. I would like for him to be able to point to a law or a policy where he can say, this is what legitimizes it, or this is what gives teachers permission to do this. And I think it would be very difficult, if not impossible, for him to do so. But on the other hand, I can say, though, I can point to laws, anti-CRT laws, dozens of them across the country, that have attempted to restrict or limit this kind of teaching.
I'm going to jump in because I do want to let you make that point about what's like really the general big picture there. But right now our audience has just heard about this privilege walk notion, where your opponent is saying this not only embodies the kind of educational direction that he is concerned about, but that it's also harmful to students. And have you heard of privilege walks? Would you endorse a privilege walk? Do you think it serves a purpose?
I think it depends on the purpose of the classroom teacher who was using it and how the classroom teacher facilitated the walk and what happened before it and after it. And I don't have those facts, so I can't make a determination without knowing what the teacher's purpose was in doing so. But I do know that the basic argument against doing walks or privilege walks is that there is no such thing as privilege, that there are not citizens in our country that are privileged and those who are not. And so that is a fundamental difference between what Mr. Rowe believes and what I believe, because I do believe privilege exists, but not just in terms of race. For example, when I got ready to get married to my spouse, who is a male, I was able to simply go to the courthouse and apply for a marriage license. That in itself makes me privileged, because two people who are of the same gender, on the other hand, would have to wonder if this is a state that allows it. Am I going to face ridicule or persecution? Am I going to face a person at the courthouse who is going to say, no, this is against my religious practices?
So can I jump in to say
I'm privileged, right?
And your feeling is that this is something that students should be
absolutely
educated. Okay, let me bring that back now to Ian. Ian, you've heard the case that Altheria just made, that whether, in this particular circumstances of the Edmonton school, it was properly, taught, the context before and after, that the notion of teaching students about privilege being a fact of American life is worthy of space on a curriculum. And I want to ask you to respond to that. And also, I want to give you a chance to talk about what's the damage of doing a privilege walk as well.
Yeah. So there's no question that privilege exists in the world. What these exercises, the oppression matrix or privilege walks, what they're explicitly saying to a child is that based on this superficial characteristic of race, you are either inherently privileged or inherently marginalized. That is incredibly destructive. Dr. Caldera also just said, are there any laws it'd be impossible for me to cite? I'll give you two that are just off the top of my head. In Oregon, the governor last year signed a bill which basically, in the name of equity and to help the Black and Latino, Latinx, Indigenous students, they eliminated the reading, writing, and math proficiency requirements for graduating from high school.
With what goal? With what goal are you saying?
With the goal of somehow helping, because they were dissatisfied with the rate, the differing high school graduation rates. The governor of Oregon just said, well, let's just suspend the requirements for demonstrating proficiency in reading, writing, and math. And you see this all across. And I'm sure that suspension
of that assessment, Mr. Rowe, probably is due to the fact that assessments in this country have been racially biased.
Okay, once again, every answer to the question is that it's systemic racism. Look, sometimes it's the test that's accurate and what is not.
But that's not what history shows us, Mr. Rowe.
Okay, well, in the case of Oregon, there's no evidence that the test itself was biased. This was singularly done because.
And I'm not
sure
I'll give you
about
that particular test, but I'm talking about standardized testing in general. I mean, if you just do a little reading on the topic, you will find that historically standardized testing, IQ testing, has been biased against people of color.
Okay, I'll give you a second example. The New Jersey Board of Education also, they were unhappy with the proficiency rates that were being demonstrated by students who were graduating from high school. So what they chose to do was they chose to essentially just lower the cut score for what would mean to be graduating from a high school in New Jersey. Under the old cut score, only about 37% of students were demonstrating proficiency. Under the new cut score, guess what? Almost 70%. Voila. Student achievement achieved. These kinds of cynical interventions that all they're doing is creating a cosmetic outcome to create some perverse form of equity is not focused on the actual problem, which is how do we strengthen things like offering school choice in the earliest of grades? How do we ensure kids are exposed to stronger, more rigorous curricula? The things that actually matter in schools versus spending time doing things like privilege walks or oppression matrices or changing standards to make people feel better but doesn't help kids.
I'll go back to my previous point about standardized testing has been historically shown to be biased against students of color. So I have no problem with changing the standards if that is the case. But I want to also make this point. I don't hear Mr. Rowe acknowledging at any point the role that systemic inequities play. Instead, Mr. Rowe takes the position that is all about individual initiatives, increasing school choice, and instead of doing these other things. Well, these other things matter. These other things matter because there are these structures in place that have historically been in place and have not been removed, because people who say that, well, that's how society used to be. Well, when did it stop, Mr. Rowe? When did schools stop being biased?
I will give you an example of systemic...
Tell me, when did it happen? When did we remove racism, and when did we remove sexism? The truth is that we haven't. So we have to still address those issues, right?
So let me give you an example of systemic inequity.
I don't think we have to choose between looking at systemic issues versus looking at individuals and families and communities. I think those things are important, but to ignore totally the fact that these students come from an ecosystem that is characterized by all these forms of inequities that are rooted in white supremacy, I think you're choosing an ignorance there.
Okay, so let's talk about systemic inequity, because you just said I've not provided any example. So let's give you an example. So in District 12 in the Bronx, where I run schools, only 7% of kids graduate from high school ready for college. Predominantly Black and Hispanic and almost all low income. That means 93% of kids start ninth grade. They either drop out or they earn their high school diploma, but still cannot do math nor reading without remediation. What's a systemic inequity? There is a cap on charter schools. If you had an idea to build a great school, even a woke school, even if you wanted to create a woke school for this community, you couldn't do it. That is a true example of a real systemic barrier that a 7-year-old cannot solve. That is an example. You say that's rooted in systemic racism. I say that's a structural barrier that is disproportionately and negatively impacting low-income Black and Hispanic students. So that is an example of systemic inequity.
I want to move on to a different question that goes to a curriculum choice to be made that has kind of emerged from the culture wars, and that is the notion that American students need to have a broader and deeper and less rose-colored understanding of certain parts of American history, and I'm speaking specifically about the legacy of slavery, which anybody who went to school in the United States over the last 60 to 70 years know that it's, generally speaking, it's touched on and then moved on. And the flashpoint emerged 5 years ago with the 1619 Project from the New York Times, which initially centered slavery as being at the core of American history, which some historians took issue with, which a lot of conservatives certainly took issue with. The New York Times ultimately slightly amended the claim and said that it was that the Revolutionary War initially was saying the Revolutionary War was fought to protect slavery and that was a primary purpose. They amended it to say it was for some people, but the story stands, and the curriculum has been adopted in some places and rejected in other places. I want to ask each of you about introduce the value or not of introducing that more complex, less uplifting account of American history into the classrooms of 4th to 8th graders. I'll let you go first with that, Ian, and then if that's okay with you, Althea, if you would go second on that.
Sure.
Okay,
Yeah, I'm very familiar with the 1619 Project. Thankfully, it has been discredited for the reasons that you suggested.
I just have to say it has not been fully discredited. It's been amended. Okay.
Yeah, thankfully, more and more schools are recognizing that it's a false history. It has language which says the founding principles were false when they were written, the claims around the American Revolution. But what we decided to do was say, you know what, the one thing that was in the defense of the 1619 Project was that it evidenced that there was strong interest in more and more educators getting historical resources in their hands to be able to teach. So we formed a group called 1776 Unites with a group of incredible Black educators, Bob Woodson, Glenn Lowry, a host of others. And we said, let's create a curriculum that could be freely distributed that's now been downloaded 200,000 times. And just to give you an example, one of the units is on the Tulsa Massacre, which often people who are woke say, this is one of the things we need to teach. Absolutely. And in our Tulsa Massacre section, there are actually 3 components of that unit. The first establishes the rise of Black Wall Street. How was it that so many Black entrepreneurs were able to raise capital, build businesses in a time when racism was enshrined into law? An incredible story of advancement against incredible adversity. Then the second component talks about the massacre and everything that was horrific about it in quite detail. And then the third component is about the rebuilding of Tulsa during that period. So when we have this discussion, it's not about banning or sugarcoating. Tell the truth, warts and all.
So
be fully honest.
And, all right, I was going to follow up by asking you, do you think the stories need to be told at all? You've just answered absolutely yes, including the stories that were untold of the contribution of African Americans to the building of America. So you've just said yes, although you reject the 1619 Project. Altheria, in light of that answer, I just wanted to take the question back to you.
I agree fully with the fact that with most of what Mr. Rowe said. I appreciate the 1619 Project personally, but I'm not an advocate. I'm not a strong advocate for it. What I'm a strong advocate for is teaching the truth. So whatever the curriculum materials are, if they are truthful and really reflect the facts of what happened, let's use it. And of course, age appropriate. And so I really appreciate Mr. Rowe's description of the curriculum surrounding the Tulsa Race Massacre. I think that's how we give a more complete picture of what some of the complexities of these issues are. But I don't think it's helpful to skim over them. I work with teachers. I'm a teacher educator, and almost all of them say that they are unprepared to teach about race and racism. Because in teacher preparation programs, we don't do enough of that work. Fortunately, I'm at American University, where our teacher education program is an anti-racist teacher education program. So anti-racism is centered in all of our coursework and in everything that we do. So we are, I would say, taking the lead on helping teachers to become more racially literate. And racial literacy simply means to be able to navigate these complex conversations about race with authenticity and truth. So I'm with Mr. Rowe on this one. I think that as long as we're doing it in truth and it shows the complete picture, and also making sure too that, like Mr. Rowe used the term, that a lot of this woke teaching makes students feel like they're victims. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think it's how it's being done. I think it is important that students know that they come from people who have been victimized. And there's nothing wrong with acknowledging that. But I think these students also need to know that they come from people who overcame and who are still overcoming.
The term that Altheria just used, Ian, anti-racism, is another one of the terms that comes into the conversation a lot, and giving teachers anti-racist training. Again, we can argue about what that term actually means in practice, but what is your response in general to that being incorporated as a part of teacher training, which is something that a lot of school districts are struggling over now?
Typically, the way anti-racist training in teacher education schools or in professional development often results, in my view, sometimes racist interventions or racist assumptions about the very idea, well, again, based on skin color, you've been a victim. Well, there are lots of white kids that have been victims in their past too, based on their particular history.
May I interrupt just to ask you this question?
So
you don't think that students of colors are victims of racism or are victims of a society that has been historically and in the present day characterized by racism?
So I think that racism exists. I'm a Black person. I certainly have faced racism
And you don't think that students need to know that? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that there's structural racism, there's institutional racism, there's systemic racism in your view. Well, I also insist that we teach that there's something called surmountable racism, that our students are not
but
over
why should
and
students
over
have to surmount the system? Why should we tell students to be tenacious and to be strong
that's life.
and
you
all
have
these
to be
qualities,
tenacious.
to have these qualities when the solution is simple? We need to dismantle racism. We shouldn't put the onus on students to have to overcome racism. Mr. Rowe, we shouldn't. We should have as our focus to dismantle it. You just said that yes, these things exist, but they also are surmountable, and that we should teach students that.
Every people that have been successful have overcome a range of challenges.
Including racism, right? So don't dismantle racism, just overcome it. So we just have it century after century. We don't address it. We just overcome it. We just jump over that hurdle.
There are millions and millions of Black people in the United States that are in the systems that you talk about that are so rigged and overwhelmingly oppressive that are successful. What can we learn from that?
They're successful, but they still experience racism. You want an example?
Yes, they do.
Ask Oprah, who goes into a shop and people think that she can't afford to buy it, and she's a billionaire, right?
Right.
So you're
Oprah's
saying,
crying herself to sleep in her jacuzzi. I hear you.
So
yes.
you're saying,
but there's a lot of there are many challenges that human beings face.
Let's just jump that hurdle. Racism is a hurdle.
We
it is an obstacle. We should be fighting we have to teach students to overcome it.
We should be fighting to eliminate racism, of course.
Wow, thank you for acknowledging that.
We should be fighting to eliminate discrimination
for you to make that acknowledgement.
Debaters, I'm going to take a break because of time. And what I'd like to do in the program now is to bring in some other voices, people who think about and work in this field and who have been listening to the conversation so far. And first person I'd like to welcome in is Randy Weingarten. Randy is the president of the American Federation of Teachers. That's a union with 1.7 million members. She's a passionate advocate of students and our school systems, and also a past debater with our program quite a while ago. So, Randy, it's been a long time, but it's nice to see you again. Unfortunately, because of time, I just need to ask you to be as brief as you can in putting a question to our debaters. Thanks.
So actually, we are 1.8 million right now because people want unions. But let me just ask this question, which is, I'm a big believer, as Ian knows, in rejecting the binary here and in rejecting the notion that anything that we talk about in terms of diversity or inclusion or teaching honest history or actually meeting the needs of kids in a safe and welcoming environment is viewed as woke. And so what do we do when we have politicians that when teachers are attempting to do all these things and meeting the needs of kids, how do we stop these barriers of naming and blaming teachers when they try to actually meet the needs of kids?
Thanks, Randy. That was a really, really tight question, and I appreciate that. Ian, do you want to take that question on first?
Well, Randy, it's good to see you. Last full disclosure, when we opened up our high school, and unfortunately, Randy and the UFT was the entity that actually sued to shut us down before we opened.
You know, you and I run charter schools.
Yes.
We both do all that stuff. I asked you a real question.
No.
As opposed to asking and saying, we both have different positions about choice and things like that. I asked you a question about this issue.
But this is part.
And the last time we saw each other was actually at an airport where you asked me to do a debate with you.
Yes, I did, and I'd love to do more. But it's part of the answer, Randy, because as you know, I run schools, and hopefully you genuinely feel that I'm someone who believes in inclusivity and ensuring that kids of all races have access to great schools, great opportunities. I think the thing that we can do the most for families is to put the power in their hands to choose. So if you have elected officials who are standing the way either of allowing more great schools of choice to open or allowing more schools to do the kind of pedagogy that you want to do, and that they're elected officials standing in the way of those being opened, then let's let more educators open schools.
On this idea of choice debate, and I don't think that's the focus of the conversation. And John, I know that I'm not the moderator,
but if you live in the Bronx,
when Randy asked him a pedagogical question,
right? But if you
and so he's not addressing that question.
I run a school in the Bronx that is a charter school that has a 99% graduation rate. And I believe in public schools. And the real issue I'm asking you, Ian, is that instead of this labeling, every time teachers are attempting to figure out how to meet the needs of kids, the issue that I'm raising with you is, why don't we go to DeSantis together and say, stop doing this nonsense, stop banning books. Why don't we stop the commissioner in New Hampshire from the divisive concepts law, which was rejected, but they now appealed it. So if you really believe what you're saying, why don't we take some of these issues and say, you've gone too far, politicians, in labeling everything that attempts to get to the needs of kids as woke.
I'm going to step in. Hold on, time out, everybody. Time out.
Yes.
I'm stepping in because Altheria is right. I have just lost control of the flow, and I am reasserting it. Randy, I want to thank you for joining us. I think we've kind of reached a brick wall on that question. So thank you very much for joining us, Randy. And Altheria, thank you for nudging me to take control back.
I didn't mean to be, the nudger
totally
here,
okay.
But I just saw Mr. Rowe going into this discussion about choice.
I agree with you that's not what we're talking about.
Yeah.
I want to now go to we were going to have another question from a parent named Lisa Liss, who was not able to join us by voice, but sent in a question. My involvement with my children's school exposed the unfortunate reality that she didn't like. What I witnessed was an education that strips children of their individualism, pushing instead for collectivism and groupthink, an academic curriculum and agenda that trades facts for feelings like empathy, and the swapping of history and civics for cultural and social welfare, and the removal of historical role models for the inclusion of activists. Ultimately, I feel that instead of building our children, our current K-12 system is breaking them, and we are sending them out into the world broken. I'm curious, and ultimately she pulled her kids out of public school because of what she said was the wokeness. I'm curious, how is what I witnessed and experienced a correct or incorrect understanding of wokeness? I like that question because the two of you are debating what wokeness actually means and the impact of it. So do you want to take that question first, Althea? You haven't had a chance to speak in a while.
Sure, but would you read again what she described as her children experiencing?
Yes. The individualism, it strips children of their individualism, pushing instead for collectivism and groupthink, an academic curriculum and agenda that trades facts for feelings, the swapping of history and civics for cultural and social welfare, the removal of historical role models for the inclusion of activists.
Okay, I'll start with the last one because activists can be historical role models. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was an activist. Rosa Parks was an activist. Cesar Chavez was an activist, right? And so her assuming is exactly what conservatives say about people who are woke, right? That we are militant, that we are activists. And I would say to that parent that activism is key to our democracy. We want citizens who are active, who have care. And when she said that the curriculum was trading facts for feelings, feelings are a legitimate part of learning. We can't pretend that they're not, right? We want to develop students who are compassionate and who are empathetic, who care about their neighbors. These are the kind of people we want to be our neighbors, to be our friends, to be our colleagues, students who grow up to be caring and compassionate.
So that Ian sounds like as American as apple pie to me. What Altheria just said. So what is your response to Lisa Liss and to her concern and to how Altheria?
Well, I'm just responding to what she described, not general, but this is what she's experienced with her own children. Facts versus feelings. The curriculum was not what she wanted, and I know you're saying that choice is not part of this discussion. She exercised choice. She decided that what was happening at that school...
And would you mind commenting on the curriculum that she described and talking about what was problematic about it?
Well, I mean, both of us heard the same description. She says that it eliminated individualism and focused on collectivism. It emphasized facts versus feelings. So if we're talking, for example, about accurate history, I'm surprised to hear you say that, well, feelings are important. Well, I'm presuming you wouldn't want facts of ensuring our young people actually understand the facts of what happened in history or in science or math.
But why does it have to be an either or? Why does it have to be facts or feelings instead of facts and feelings?
Well, I don't know. Well, I'm not sure when we were saying fact. That's not what she said. She said it replaced facts with feelings.
Yes.
And I'm not sure how one would go about constructing the curriculum focused on feelings alone. But clearly, this parent felt it wasn't meeting the need, and she has the privilege to be able to make a choice. She left her school and presumably is in a school now that she believes is meeting her children's need. And I know, again, you're saying choice is not part of this discussion, but for many people, choice is the only lever that they have to escape schools that are not aligned.
I'm going to jump in,
mission.
and I understand why the choice for you is a kind of policy implication of everything that you're saying. But what I feel we're not hearing from you, and also in Randy's question, is sort of the question being asked: how does it hurt students? How does that, including that sort of putting those sorts of issues onto the agenda, how does it hurt students? So I just want to drop. I'm not debating with you myself, but just as the defender of what the question is, I just want to kind of give you a sense that the audience is expecting to hear you address the content and how it hurts students. I want to bring that to our next questioner, just to have that thought with you for our next questioner. And I want to welcome Pete Dominic. Pete's a political comedian, and he's a talk radio and podcast host and does a range of political and cultural topics. I asked Pete to join the conversation because I listened to his podcast, and he talks a lot about his own involvement with school board meetings at the system where his own kids went to school, and I think one is still in the system. So he cares a lot about public education. Pete, welcome to Open to Debate, and please come in with your question.
Great to be here. I really enjoyed listening to the debate. The question is there any policy from any state that is creating this inferiority or victimhood? What policy in what state?
I've shared a couple. One in Oregon. The governor of Oregon, similar to what's potentially now going to happen in New York State, has eliminated the high school graduation requirements to demonstrate proficiency in reading, math, and writing in the name of equity. That is in my view, very destructive policy.
Pete, thanks so much for joining us. Next, I want to bring in Emily Jashinsky. She is the D.C. correspondent for Unheard and co-host of the weekly news show Counterpoint. Emily, thanks for joining us, and please come in with your question.
My question is based on the original premise of the debate, which is wokeness good for students? I think we would have less conflict if we had a definition of wokeness that was perhaps more broad, that was perhaps more welcoming, that was perhaps more truly diverse. And maybe this question is best directed at Dr. Caldera, because I'm wondering, when you defined wokeness as sociopolitical awareness and a commitment to social justice, whether it would be appropriate to include concepts like Ian's, maybe saying that getting rid of some of these standardized tests is a bad idea, or disagreeing with the concept of equity, whether that would allow him as a Black man to be included in the definition of social justice and sociopolitical awareness that is central to the definition of wokeness here.
Would you mind asking the question? I'm not sure I got it. It was lost in what you were saying. If you'd help me with that.
Sure. Is wokeness inclusive of viewpoints that disagree with a narrow left of center definition of social justice? Because it is typical that when somebody like Ian shares his perspective as a Black man, he would be called someone who is outside the boundaries of woke thought, outside the boundaries of acceptable thought. Is that good for students?
I think that Mr. Rowe would place himself wherever he places himself. I see space in the woke world for anyone who is committed to equity, who is committed to justice for all. So if Mr. Rowe sees himself as being part of those who are committed to equity and justice. And I think the one thing that I'll go back to time and time again is that Mr. Rowe refuses to acknowledge the extent to which these structural inequities impact student lives, and would rather put the emphasis and the onus on the student to overcome these things. You know, there's this word that students must have grit. They got to be tough. Well, I don't think that's the student's responsibility. I think that is the adult responsibility to dismantle these systems that have oppressed their ancestors for generations and continue to oppress them today. So to me, part of being woke, the foundational component is acknowledging that there are systemic inequities that continue to plague students' lives, and that one of our goals as adults should be to dismantle these inequities. And it doesn't mean that we can't teach students grit and perseverance and tenacity and all those things. As I said earlier, I don't live in this either or world. I live in a world where we do that. We teach students these positive attributes that we want them to hold, but we also help students to know that there is a reality, and this reality is that our systems are operated under white dominance or white supremacy. And with the goal of all of our work as people who are in the woke mob is to dismantle this system.
So if you don't believe in equity, you don't belong in the curriculum. Is that a fair assessment of the position?
That if you don't believe in equity, you don't belong in the curriculum?
Right. So an author who argues against equity should not be in a school curriculum.
Not at all. Not at all. I thank you for that question, because I think that's a misconception that's part of what we do is indoctrinate. And I think I heard that in the parents' concern too, around this idea of groupthink, right? Like we have to persuade students or indoctrinate students to feel a certain way. No, we put the material, we put the truth, and we put the facts in front of students, and we have them to engage in inquiry and exploration and interrogate each other and history and facts, and let them come to their own conclusion about it. It is not
so
about
Ian's book could be included in a curriculum.
I'm not familiar with Ian's
Emily,
book. I've never read Ian's book.
I have to jump in. I think you've made your point, and thank you very much for coming in with your question. And Ian, you've been very patient for the last few minutes. You haven't been able to speak, and so you're going to get the last word in this particular round. I just want to take to you Altheria's depiction of you as somebody who is not accepting at all the notion of systemic problems. And I actually think that I did hear you say that
multiple
you acknowledge
times.
Systemic problems.
Multiple times. No, absolutely. I think it's a narrative that's convenient to use, but it's not based in the truth. I've said several times that there are true systemic barriers, whether it be the inability to choose a great school for your own child, or systems that have removed standards of excellence so that the
but
bar
those
is
are not
lowered
those
for
are
all
not the
kids.
ones she's referring to. She's referring,
and he knows that. He knows that.
Yeah, but
he is
when
avoiding this conversation about the racism being a barrier, about sexism being a barrier, about classism being a barrier, and he'd rather go to
let
these
Ian
issues.
respond to the specifics. Then.
Certainly, those are barriers where I think
that
where we
students should just jump over.
Where we divert, we should all be working to remove any kind of barrier that impedes any child of any race to be successful. That could be based on class, race, sex, gender identity, any of those things.
Awesome.
We should all
I'm
be
so glad to hear you
we
say
should
that.
all be fighting. But if we don't also acknowledge that young people are not victims. They have the potential to be architects of their own lives. We have to be focused on those things. I run schools for this very reason. I fight to remove the systemic barriers, most notably, I know you don't like to hear it, but most notably giving young people the ability to find a great school that would allow them to get on this path for success.
Do you try to remove the barrier of racism or the barrier of sexism or classism? All these barriers that are in place because of white supremacy. Is that part of your work
when you
too,
keep saying white supremacy,
white supremacist culture?
Well, why is it that only 35% of all, or 38% of all white kids are reading at grade level if white supremacy is the single biggest challenge?
No, did I say that? I said it's a challenge.
Okay.
I said it's a challenge. I didn't say that it was the singles. You're putting words in my mouth.
We've hit one of those walls
there.
where we're going a little bit in circles again, and the timing is perfect.
Yeah, he put words in my mouth. I didn't say that it was the biggest challenge.
I'm going to wrap this round and move on to our
closing round. Even though it is the biggest challenge.
And in our closing round, our closing round is comprised of each of you making a closing statement without interruption, I want to point out. You get the floor one last time, and Ian, you are up first for this. Once again, on the question of whether wokeness in public schools is hurting students or helping, you are saying hurting. This is your last chance to make the case.
Yep. Thank you once again for having me. And just to reiterate, there are both systemic challenges and barriers standing in the way. We should all be fighting to remove those, and as well as ensuring our young people understand the power that they do have, even in the face of barriers of any kind. It's interesting, after winning the gold medal in the 100-meter race at the 2024 Olympics, Noah Lyles posted on X, quote, "I have asthma, allergies, dyslexia, ADD, anxiety, and depression. But I will tell you that what you have does not define what you can become. Why not you?" End quote. That inspiring message is what we teach our students every single day. No singular characteristic defines them nor inhibits their sense of possibility. In my view, advocates for wokeness in children are sometimes determined to convince children that these systems are so rigged, so powerful. There's no question that we can talk about actual history, but to give the impression that these systems are so powerful that you do not have the ability to overcome, I think is a real danger, and I've seen it happen with kids. At our high school Vertex Partnership Academies, we organize our school around the cardinal virtues, one of which being courage. I reject victimhood and boldly persevere, even in times of uncertainty and struggle. That is a core value that we believe. It's not telling the kids that they need to overcome anything. We're fighting to remove barriers as well, but we need our young people to know that life is not fair, and it's not just issues of race or other factors. You have to be tenacious. You do have to have grit. You have to exercise agency. Let me close by sharing the words of Alexis de Tocqueville when he observed America. He said, "The greatness of America lies not in being more enlightened than any other nation, but rather in her ability to repair her faults." I've always loved that quote because it suggests America, like each of our young people, has the tools of self-betterment and self-renewal and self-determination within them. Let's activate our young people to do just that.
Thank you, Ian. And now, Altheria, you have the last word in this debate. One more time to tell us why you believe that wokeness in public schools is helping students.
Ian, I would appreciate if you send me that quote. I really appreciate that one, by the last one that you just shared about America having the ability to repair her faults, because that to me lies at the heart of what woke pedagogy promotes. It is this idea that we aren't there yet as a country, and that it is up to us as citizens to help our students get there. Tonight's debate at its core is about the purpose of schooling in the 21st century. We have asked ourselves and each other whether wokeness is one of those functions of schools. I've argued emphatically that critical consciousness, awareness of injustice, and purposeful solution seeking are integral to schooling in a society plagued by centuries of inequity. Since conservatives often invoke the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I'd like to share a rarely used quote in which he stated what he believed to be the purpose of education. Quote, "Education must enable one to sift and weigh evidence, to discern the truth from the false, the real from the unreal, and the facts from the fiction. The function of education then, therefore, is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically, end quote. This purpose aligns completely with the goals of woke pedagogy, which are above all else to prepare students for active citizenship by teaching them to think intensively and critically. The choice is ours. Do we want schools who create students who are uninformed about social issues, who don't know how to form arguments that are rooted in facts, who don't know how to analyze systemic issues from different perspectives, who don't see that their humanity is inextricably bound up in the humanity of others? Or do we want schools that create students who know how to grapple with complex problems, who know how to collaborate with others, to address social issues, and pursue truth through scholarly interest? Schools can serve to reproduce the social order as it exists or to disrupt it. If justice for all is truly our goal, we need wokeness in schools.
Thank you, Altheria. And that is a wrap on this debate. And I want very much to thank our debaters, Ian Rowe and Altheria Caldera. We so appreciate that you were willing to show up for this and to actually hear each other out and to approach the argument with an open mind, open to one another's positions. As much as you disagreed with each other, we believe that you heard each other. And that's what we aim to show can happen in our culture. Thank you so much to both of you for being here.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Dr. Caldera.
Oh, thank you so much, Mr. Rowe. I've learned from you and appreciate this opportunity very much. And thank you, John, for having us and for moderating this discussion.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure. I also want to thank our fellow question askers for bringing their insight to the table. So thank you, Randy and Pete and Emily. And finally, a big thanks to you, our audience, for tuning into this episode of Open to Debate. I just want to point out, as I always do, that we're a nonprofit that is working to combat extreme polarization through civil debate by showing there's such a thing as good argument. Our work is made possible by listeners like you and by the Rosencrantz Foundation and by supporters of Open to Debate. Robert Rosencrantz is our chairman. Our CEO is Clea Connor. Leah Mathau is our chief content officer. Elizabeth Kitzenberg is our chief advancement officer. This episode was produced by Alexis Pangrazi and Marlette Sandoval. Editorial and research by Gabriella Mayer and Andrew Foote. Andrew Lipson and Max Fulton provided production support. The Open to Debate team also includes Gabrielle Iannicelli, Rachel Kemp, Eric Gross, and Linda Lee. Damien Whittemore mixed this episode. Our theme music is by Alex Clement. And I'm John Donvan. This is Open to Debate. We'll see you next time.